PatientCareFoundation.org.
Morning and welcome to America's Web Radio. Again, you might say, and again we have...
Continue our talk about what the producer here calls the 21st century Cold War, but I don't think it's such a Cold War, and I'll talk about that shortly. But I do want to say one thing, because I was asked this question, does John Marshall have any conservative law professors? And the answer is yes. Aside from me, we do have a few. We even have a few moderates who vote Republican, which makes us one of the most unusual law schools in the country, because most law schools are so far left and the faculty is so far left that they make Bernie Sanders almost look conservative. Well, that's a joke because he isn't, obviously. But before I get into this idea of the culture war, the war that's going on for the soul of America, I want to address how Adam Schiff fits into that. Why did Nancy Pelosi choose a serial liar like Adam Schiff to carry the ball on this impeachment? Number one, Nancy Pelosi knew that the impeachment would not succeed. She also knows there's no real evidence of an impeachable crime. You know, it's perfectly okay for the president to fulfill his duties and investigate corruption. And do you know any politician who does things that won't benefit him politically? I mean, why do they have multiple reasons for doing something, but one of the reasons for doing things for politicians, will it benefit me politically? So even if whatever Trump wanted done would benefit him politically, so what? He had a statutory duty to make sure our aid wasn't used for corrupt purposes. So that's all nonsense. So the question is, why pick Adam Schiff? Why pick the serial liar? And the answer to that is, a lot of it's kind of right out of Saul Alinsky, the famous left-wing organizer, who we'll talk about, who trained, by the way, Hillary Rodham, who later became Hillary Rodham Clinton, and also was his ideas were adopted by Barack Obama when he became an organizer, a community organizer. But let's take a look at, again, why did Pelosi pick him? The goal was to, and this is per Saul Alinsky, is to ruin a person personally, the politics of personal destruction. So it made no difference how many lies Schiff told or the Democrats tell. It makes no difference, because what they're trying to do is create an aura of negativity around somebody. That's all Saul Alinsky said, how you win battles, how you get your way, whether with corporations or politicians. You threaten them personally. You demonize them personally. And that's exactly what Pelosi did. And so those who say, well, Nancy Pelosi really didn't want to do this. Yes, she did want to do this. She wanted to surround Trump with negative atmosphere in the hopes of beating him. Unfortunately for Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats, their list of candidates don't seem too impressive. Let's see, we have Joe Biden, who was my senator when I lived in Delaware, a gaffe-prone liar who's now have a whiff of, let's say, cognitive decline about him, not to mention the corruption issue. After all the Bidens have become wealthy while he's been in the vice president. Yeah, I mean, you say, well, Joe Biden doesn't lie. I mean, it gaffes. Yeah, he's very gaffe prone. Yeah, I mean, the last time he was out there saying how he needed a young vice president, so if he died in office, there was someone to succeed him. I mean, really, that's a wonderful thing to talk about. But anyway, let's talk about that just for a moment before I get into the bulk of this thing. Joe Biden, when he first ran for senator and from Delaware, he talked about being born in Delaware. No, Joe, you were born in Pennsylvania. Oh, that's right. Had to correct that. Well, I was near the top of my law school class. No, Joe, you were near the bottom of your law school class. I marched with the civil rights people in the 60s. No, Joe, you never marched with anybody. I always thought that Anita Hill, when she testified against Clarence Thomas, was very credible. No, Joe, you're on record in a tape, in a television interview, saying that you didn't think Anita Hill was very credible. My wife, my first wife and daughter were killed by a drunk truck driver. No, Joe, he wasn't drunk, and he wasn't at fault for the accident. And in fact, when he asked you to quit calling him a drunk truck driver, you continued calling him a drunk truck driver, despite the fact that that wasn't true. So we have a whole series of gaffes and little lies from good old Joe, and he's increasingly gaffe prone. This is a great state of Ohio. No, Joe, you're in Iowa. This is terrific here in New Hampshire. No, Joe, you're in Vermont. So there's a whole bunch of things that would make Joe Biden a non-viable candidate. So you go to Elizabeth Warren. I must say, she's been surprising. She is coming. I mean, she's almost vomit-inducing. She's such a pandering, whiny, lying, hectoring, like a spinster aunt. And I don't see how she thinks by pandering to every group she's in front of that this is going to be get her the presidency. She wasn't fired. She wasn't let go because she was pregnant from her teaching job. She gave it up voluntarily. She's been interviewed and said that. There's an interview of her saying that. There's also the official records of the school board who offered her a continued job, but she didn't want to take it. They even sent her a letter saying how sorry they were that she was leaving. And how about, oh, you're for public school. Well, how come you send your children to private school? Oh, I didn't do that. Yes, she did. So we have those things. And what's her latest pandering thing? She wants a 9-year-old transsexual student to choose her Secretary of Education. That's her last thing. How much more pandering can you do? So I don't think the Democrats are in great shape. They seem to be down to serious candidate Bernie Sanders, who's so far left that he has to be regularly denied that he's really a total socialist. He's democratic socialist, which is, and we'll talk about the difference, at least on Nikolai Lenin's idea of the difference. And of course, now there's talk of Michael Bloomberg. Can you believe that a party that's into identity politics, who a lot of the leading politicians, including Buttigieg, apologize for being white? I think Biden did it once too. They're thinking about nominating another 70-year-old billionaire, so we'll have two 70-year-old billionaires against each other, Bloomberg and Trump. I don't see it. Especially a party that has a wing of the party which smacks of anti-Semitism. I mean, Bloomberg is obviously Jewish, where Bernie Sanders is culturally Jewish only. All right, let me go on to really what the topic is today, and that is the Saul Alinsky takeover of the Democratic Party in terms of strategy. And of course, Saul Alinsky is always advocated power. The whole idea was get power. And I'm going to read you a couple of things from Saul Alinsky that you might find interesting, and you might start saying, the Democrats, that sounds like the Democrats. It really does sound like the Democrats. And a lot of this is from his Rules for Radicals, and some from a talk he gave or an interview he gave to the New Republic. I'm going to read this. The following anecdote about Alinsky's teachings are recounted by the New Republic's Ryan Lizza, nicely illustrates the focus of Alinsky's radicalism. When Alinsky would ask new students why they wanted to organize, they would invariably respond with selfless bromides about wanting to help others. Alinsky would then scream back at them that there was a one-word answer: you want to organize for power. My. That's what it sounds like the Democrats are doing. It's all about power, not about issues, not about the country as it is. It's about power, taking power. And some of these groups that are roughly allied with the Democrats, like Antifa, it's power. In Rules for Radicals, Alinsky wrote, "From the moment an organizer enters a community, he lives, dreams, eats, breathes, sleeps only one thing, and that is to build a mass power base of what he calls the army. The issue is never the issue. The issue is always the revolution." Some of Bernie Sanders' field people certainly seem to believe that. When they say, no, Bernie doesn't really mean what he says. He's not really a democratic socialist. He's really a Marxist-Leninist. And we'll have gulags and re-education camps. We'll take care of those Trump supporters. Unlike the communists, who identified their goal as a Soviet state and thereby generated opposition to their schemes, Alinsky and his followers organized their power bases without naming the end game, without declaring a specific future they want to achieve: socialism, communism, a dictatorship of the proletariat, or anarchy, without committing themselves to concrete principles or a specific future. They organize exclusively to build a power base, which they can then use to destroy the existing society and its economic system. By refusing to commit to principles or to identify their goal, they have been able to organize a coalition of all the elements of the left who were previously divided by disagreements over means and ends, because the only end is power. The only end, after you get power, you decide who lives and who dies. One of the things Alinsky, by the way, that quote was from David Horowitz, the Freedom Center, and that was from a booklet he put out, or that analysis, I should say, of a booklet he put out called Barack Obama's Rules for Revolution, the Alinsky Model. Of course, some other really interesting things, and you start thinking about what Alinsky said, how you analyze what he said, and you start to think, what are the Democrats up to? What's really going on? Why the Democrats have aligned themselves with groups, violent groups like Antifa? And they have. They said good things about them. I'll read some of the good things the Democrats have said. Alinsky begins his text by telling readers exactly what a radical is. He is not a reformer of the system, but a would-be destroyer. Well, that sounds familiar. Destroying, let's see, AOC and the squad. What are they up to? In his own mind, a radical is building his own kingdom, which to him is a kingdom of heaven on earth. Utopian scheme, religion. That's what the progressives are about. The religion, new man, new heaven on earth. And if you oppose the religion, you oppose heaven on earth, you have to be evil. That's why the left always consider we conservatives evil, while we just consider the left wrong. We're evil. We're deplorables. We're rubes. Such a kingdom of heaven built by human beings, of course, is a fantasy, an impossible dream. The radical's only real-world efforts are those which are aimed at subverting the society he lives in. The typical leftist is a nihilist. Destruction is his game. And you hear that from Dennis Prager on the radio, that the left destroys everything it touches. We're up to a break.
Want to give your favorite online the perfect gift? Then go online and check out the TornadoBodyDryer.com. I'm not blind, and the warm heat air massage it gives me after my shower. The Tornado Body Dryer is super. You'll love it, and you'll love having one in your shower. Brown, retired Army Colonel and president of the Johns Creek Veterans Association. We meet in Newtown Park, and part of one of our projects is the installation of the Higgins Wall, the half-scale model of the Vietnam Wall that traveled the United States. Well, it's coming to rest, and it's going to live in Johns Creek forever, the half-scale model. We're looking at possibly a March implementation of a ribbon-cutting ceremony, and we're looking for donors and sponsors that want to help us in this great project. You can donate at jcvets.org. This is Ron Camacho, host of the Business Hour, on Fridays from 10 to 11 a.m. Join me as I talk with passionate professionals on a program that profiles the best businesses, business professionals, business practices, and fascinating individuals to get an insider view of how America works. 10 to 11 a.m. on America's Web Radio. This is America's Web Radio. Would you like to have a show, talk about your business, or express your opinion on America's Web Radio? Just email jm@americaswebradio.com and we'll get back to you. Thank you.
This is Professor Robert J. D'Agostino, back with more of Do Facts Matter? And again, the answer to that question is, to the left, they don't. They're ideological, and they believe in this fantasy about a utopia if only they could have power. And of course, it's not only Saul Alinsky, it's Saul Alinsky, adopting Marxist-Leninist tactics. And the entire left essentially is a Marxist Leninist operation. And let me tell you what Marx said. Marx was summing up the radicals' passion by invoking a comment of in Mephistopheles, Goethe's Mephistopheles, and that is, quote, "Everything that exists deserves to perish. The essence of what it means to be a radical is thus summed up by Alinsky's praise for Satan. That means you must be willing to destroy the values, structures, and institutions that sustain society in which we live." Now look, those interested, all you need to do is take a look at Antonio Gramsci, the Italian communist socialist, who wrote about the destruction of the institutions, the church. My goodness, we've gone from America, from a Christian nation to a post-Christian nation, now in the elite areas to an anti-Christian nation. Christian groups are under attack everywhere. Students who try to bring Bibles to school to read during their lunch hour have their Bibles confiscated and maybe even told they can't bring those books. Religious organizations are denied access to facilities that every other organization can have access to. The religious in Massachusetts, that's right, it was the Catholic religious groups that was having children with special needs placed in foster care or adopted, and because they discriminated against non-Catholics in hiring, Massachusetts closed them down. So all these kids who could have been placed, all these children who needed placement, they didn't get placement. And this has happened in more places than one. So destruction of institutions, particularly destructions of institutions that enforce the law, like the police. I mean, what's going on in San Francisco? You've all seen that on TV. Despicable conditions on the streets of San Francisco. But the people of San Francisco essentially elected a prosecutor who essentially said he wasn't going to enforce any laws. He was decriminalizing things like shoplifting. well, it may be a civil offense, but you're decriminalizing it. So you have tape recordings, you have films of people just shoplifting at will, and that's the sort of, what can you do about it? He said, I can't do anything. The police won't come because it's decriminalized. So, as far as I'm concerned, the people of San Francisco get what they deserve. They want to live in filth. The problem is not there. Let them have their problems. The problem is because of all these homeless people, these illegals, these, as one person put it, medieval diseases have come back. Typhus, tuberculosis. They're all showing up in San Francisco. So those of you who are planning to go to San Francisco, change your destination. Try a place where there's still civilized society. Well, what about this progressive stuff? Is it really this bad? And the answer is yes. The Progressive Party was actually a front created by the communists back in the 40s, 30s, and 40s. And Henry Wallace, who was vice president under Roosevelt, his third term, and he didn't get his fourth term as a vice president because the Democratic establishment in those days were still not so far left that they wanted someone they considered a communist to run for president or to be vice president in case Roosevelt. They knew about Roosevelt's health problems, and they were quite concerned. That's how Harry Truman got the job. And what's kind of interesting about that, and this is a sidebar, is that Richard Russell, who is the senator from Georgia, was a choice to be vice president under Roosevelt for the fourth term, which means Richard Russell, not Truman, would have become president if he had been chosen as vice president. The reason Richard Russell wasn't chosen really centered around the fact that he was a segregationist, a committed segregationist, and the Democrats did not want that, to their credit, of course. So they went and picked Harry Truman, who they figured was a safe bet, a party man, and if Roosevelt passed away, which they kind of half expected it to happen, Truman would become president, and not a segregationist like Richard Russell or a communist like Henry Wallace. And and as David Horowitz says, his parents, who were card-carrying communists, never referred to themselves as communists, but always as progressives, and did their friends and political comrades. The Progressive Party was led, of course, by Henry Wallace, as I just said. It was the chosen vehicle of the communists to lead their followers out of the Democratic Party, which they had joined during the Popular Front of the 1930s. The progressives, and this is crucial to understand what's going on, the progressives rejoined the Democrats during the McGovern campaign of 1972, and with the formation of a 100-plus member Progressive Caucus in the Congressional Party and the ascension of Barack Obama to the presidency, have become its most important political force. Now remember what my son, Joseph D'Agostino, said 2 weeks ago, and that is the whole idea was of the progressives, the leftists, the communists, and their allies, was to infiltrate as many institutions as they could, and they have successfully done so. So I commend to my listeners David Horowitz' Freedom Foundation and some of the stuff that he writes, some of his booklets that he writes. It's really called the David Horowitz Freedom Center, and that's in Sherman Oaks, California. I'm a contributor to him, and I get his materials. And one of the interesting things, of course, and I mentioned this 2 weeks ago, or last week, in fact, a lot of this progressive movement, this utopian, this heaven on earth nonsense, started, the secular beginning of that was the French Revolution. Before that, these utopian schemes were kind of Christian. If you think about the Pilgrims and the fact that for the first 2 years they starved because they were really a commune. They really were in a pure sense, a communist. Everything was shared by everybody, so they all were starving to death. So the third year, Bradford, who was leading it, said, no more of that stuff. Now you don't work, you don't eat, you can own private property, and suddenly the community flourished. This is interesting. I'm going to read this from the Horowitz pamphlet. One kind of hell or another is what radicalism has in fact achieved since the beginning of the modern age, when it conducted the first modern genocide during the French Revolution. Remember, French Revolution, liberty, equality, friendship, fraternity, equality, this is all stuff. This was a French Revolution. And, of course, the French Revolution did a little different than that. I'll repeat again what Danton, one of the leaders of the French Revolution, said, that in order to create this utopia, he was prepared to turn the soil of France red with blood. So that was the first modern genocide. The Jacobins who led the revolution changed the name of the Cathedral of Notre Dame to the Temple of Reason, and then, in the name of reason, proceeded to slaughter every Catholic man, woman, and child in the Vendée region, it's France that is, to purge religious superstition from the planet. The Jacobin attempt to liquidate Catholics and their faith was the precursor of Lenin's destruction of 100,000 churches in the Soviet Union to purge Russia of reactionary ideas. The Temple of Reason was replicated by the Bolsheviks' creation of a People's Choice, whose mission was to usher in the workers' paradise. The mission led to the murder of not of 40,000 or so in the Vendée, but 40 million before its merciful collapse, with progressives cheering its progress and mourning its demise. And that's true. They did mourn its demise. I have a friend of mine who's a professor at a liberal arts college, and when the Soviet Union fell, he got up in the faculty meeting and was in tears. There must have been something good about the Soviet Union. This couldn't have happened. Now, she herself, this professor friend of mine, was a liberal, and she didn't mourn the fall of the Soviet Union, but she had professors at that institution, a very prestigious institution, that did. We're up to a break. I'll be right back with Do Facts Matter.
Get your pen and paper ready. If there's a move in your near future, I want to tell you that the folks I used and will recommend is a Raintown Movers. Timothy and the guys recently moved me, and I am and was totally satisfied with a sometimes not so fun experience moving. Call Timothy at 770-378-4708 and make it a good move and a good experience. Around Town Movers for that local or cross-country move. Timothy, Around Town Movers, in my opinion, are the best. That's Around Town Movers. Call them.
Whether cruising the strip in a 57 Chevy or taking the family on a vacation in a 71 Oldsmobile Vista Cruiser, you need to tune in to Classic Cars with Steve Ronaldo and Jim Weber every Saturday from 8 to 9 a.m. on americaswebradio.com.
If your health insurance premium is more than your mortgage, Ellen Deal with Ideal Solutions is here to help. Whether you're a small business owner, individual family, or baby boomer, email maga45cag@gmail.com and I'll respond with 3 easy questions to help you determine if you can get away from Obamacare. As a 20-year veteran of the insurance industry, I'm here to help with all your insurance needs. Email Ellen Deal at maga45cag@gmail.com.
This is America's Web Radio. Would you like to have a show, talk about your business, or express your opinion on America's Web Radio? Just email jm@americaswebradio.com and we'll get back to you. Thank you.
Facts Matter. And we're we're talking about some of the material published by the Freedom Center, by David Horowitz's Freedom Center, and that the origin comes from the actual writings of Saul Alinsky, and actually, I'm going to shortly give you some quotes from the collected works of Lenin, which seem to have no life within the left in this country, including the Democratic Party. Here's an interesting, the radical fantasy, again from David Horowitz, the radical fantasy of an earthly redemption takes many forms. So here we have some of their projects put into place. The sexual liberation caused leftists to condemn and ban the proven public health methods for combating AIDS, testing and contact tracing as homophobic, leading directly to the preventable deaths of more than 300,000 gay men in the prime of their life. Well, what are they doing with post-transsexuals? Look, the LG, lesbian, gay, transsexual, bisexual, transsexual movement, what's going on there? Same-sex attraction may very well have an element of genetic basis, or partial genetic basis, or genetic basis that mixed with certain environmental factors. So there's a lot of evidence that there's a genetic propensity of varying degrees for same-sex attraction. So let's take the L and the G out of this, lesbian and gay, and the B, the bisexual. But transsexual is sexual dysphoria. These people need psychological help, not encouragement. I mean, hormonal treatment is devastating to the health of the person taking it. The American Heart Association has spoken about that, has written about that, how much damage this hormonal treatment can do. Sex change operations, in some surveys up to 80% of those who have sex change operations regret it. And we're going to let children have sex change operations? And your transsexual is going to pick the Department of Education cabinet member for President Elizabeth Warren? Come on. Don't you think those people who are suffering from this, and I'm not talking about mere same-sex attraction. I'm talking about people who think they're a different gender, people who think they're gender fluid. No. XX, you're female. XY, you're male. Brain structure is slightly different, males and females. Muscular is different, males and females. Bone structure is different, males and females. And you can't change that. So if you have problems, if there's gender fluid, or you think you're a girl when you're a boy, or a boy when you're a girl, initially you need to get some psychological help, some psychiatric or psychological help, some mental health professional to help you work through this. And the number of people who regret sex change is extremely high percentage-wise. The harm done by these operations, hormonal treatment, is almost incalculable for some people. So why encourage it? But the left encourages it. And the parents who want to start their kids, 9-year-old kid, on hormonal treatments, come on. There's 2 states, thank goodness, that are going to make it illegal to start these kind of treatments before puberty. One would hope so. One would hope so that these treatments would be illegal up to the age of 18. Then you're adult, you want to destroy yourself, go right ahead. Be sad about it, but, what can you do? Okay, some other things that have been wonderful. The crusade to rid mankind of DDT, which was launched in the 60s by the American environmentalist Rachel Carson, led to a global ban on the use of DDT and the return of malaria. This resulted in the deaths of about 100 million children, mainly black Africans under the age of 2. Of all the pesticides, DDT is probably the least harmful. And overuse, of course, is harmful. Overuse is always harmful. And there needs to be regulations dealing with pesticides and their use and how much of their use, because they can pollute the water, they can pollute the ground, but particularly water, and they can cause harm to people. But the trade-off, taking DDT out of commission, very effective against mosquitoes, and less harmful than most insecticides even used today, because somebody said so. Yeah, and of course for this country, the most terrible thing, the Great Society. The Great Society destroyed the inner city families, the families of lower income folks, which were mostly minority families. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the famous sociologist from Harvard, professor, who became an advisor to President Kennedy, an advisor to President Johnson, an advisor to President Nixon, who was there at the beginning of these Great Society anti-poverty programs, who became a U.S. Senator, Democrat, from New York. He wrote about how those Great Society programs, and you can pick up that article on the internet, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Destruction of the Black Family. Pick it up. Read it. How the Great Society program destroyed lower income families. I mean, what was one of the results of the war on poverty? That men were relieved of the duty of supporting their children. That was called Aid for Dependent Children, one of the worst programs ever foisted upon the American people. Of course, it made the people who supported it, people who passed it, feel good. Oh, we're going to help little children. We're going to help children, get them out of poverty and get them food and everything else. We're going to help. Well, no one was starving before that anyway. But we're going to help these kiddies. Oh, no, yeah, we got to do that. Be careful when you support something that makes you feel good and that harms the so-called beneficiaries. You've got to understand what a program does to projected beneficiaries. Oh, aid for dependent children. Oh, you're so mean. You want little children to starve. Well, they don't starve. Which brings me up to an interesting point right now. The left is happy to say, oh, there are 37 million Americans in poverty. And right now the poverty rate, of course, is declining. The official government poverty rate is 11.3%, and it's going down. And I always tell my students, don't pay attention to the poverty rate. Pay attention to the direction of the poverty rate. If it's going down, things are getting better. If it's going up, because the government's definition of poverty is really strange. Let's see. In this country, the typical person in a family in poverty has more living space than a middle-class person in Europe. 80-some-odd% have air conditioning. 90-some-odd% have TVs, mostly with 2 TVs. They have cable. They have a car. In terms of food problems, and this is all public information. I'm not making this up. You go look at the internet, look at the Census Bureau stuff. In food insecurity, the estimate is 0.5%. That means 0.5% have food insecurity. If you're hungry in this country, it's mostly because someone is not feeding you. Look what happened in public schools when Michelle Obama, with all good intentions, decided the food should be more nutritious. The children threw it in the garbage. Doesn't sound like they were all that hungry when they threw the good food in the garbage. And of course, they demanded pizza and macaroni and cheese. I'm not saying you should give them exactly what they want, but you got to be realistic about what they'll eat and what they won't eat. And certainly, all that food, I guess it made the farmers happy having all that food thrown in the garbage, because they had to supply the so-called nutritious food that none of the kids didn't eat.
We had a saying in the Army call, or we had, as we would leave our mess halls with our trays, we had one trash can that said edible garbage and one that said paper. And the edible garbage was picked up by the farmers for their pigs.
That's right. I mean, you got to do something with it, right? And people will eat what people want to eat. I mean, I guess if you're really starving, you'll eat almost anything. But no one in this country is really starving, other than perhaps that 0.5%, 0.5% who have food insecurity. It didn't say they were starving. That's food insecurity. Truly, and by the way, the interesting thing about this is once a month some schools have candy day, and if you bring in $5, you can buy this candy, $5 worth of candy. Every kid in the school, whether they're on a food program, whether they're supposed to be too poor to buy their lunches, comes in with the $5. I mean, let's face it, this is an
Amazing how
incredibly
that works, isn't it?
well, this is a very wealthy country, and this idea that 37 million Americans are in poverty is nuts. They're not in poverty. They have a lower standard of living than lots of the rest of us. But, you know, some years ago, there was a survey of the people so-called in poverty, and the way the government counts income and earned income and what have you. Turned out that something like 60-some-odd thousand people who were counted on the poverty rolls, I mean, that's not a lot compared to millions, had two homes. The homes they lived in ordinarily and their Florida vacation home. So that's real poverty. I'm telling you, that is real poverty. In any case, so progressives don't pay attention to the fact, because no matter what happens, no matter how good things are, they want things destroyed so they can rebuild the ultimate utopia. And of course, that's why their favorite candidate is Bernie Sanders, who seems to be with them in a lot of ways. I have here, if you take a look at what's going on with, let's say, violent movements like Antifa, and by the way, they're not the only violent left-wing group out there. There's Antifa, there's the Revolutionary Abolitionist Movement, which is RAM. They've got a movement called Refuse Fascism, another movement, By Any Means Necessary, and there's It's Going Down is another group. There's a whole bunch of these groups, and they're tied up together. And the Me Too movement, at least the violent wing of the Me Too movement's tied up with this. And one of the interesting things you need to consider is who's funding these groups. Now, we know a lot of the activists are just trust babies from wealthy families, having their fun, joining something bigger than they are, this anti-fascist movement, and Trump, of course, being the chief fascist. This is the anti-fascist movement, and we're part of a great movement, and we feel like we're doing something for the world, and we're doing something for the country, and we're part of, and everybody's, together, fighting together, and it's easy to get young folks suckered like this. I mean, after all, who did Pol Pot use in Cambodia to kill his fellow Cambodians? It was young 13-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 9-year-olds. They were inspired by Pol Pot to create New Man in Cambodia. Who did the Cultural Revolution, Mao Zedong, get to beat up their professors and kill their professors in China during the Cultural Revolution? Young folks, college students, high school students, young folks. Who did Hitler use in Germany? Look at the brown shirts. We're up against the break.
Quick Stakes, that's Q-U-I-K Stakes, are not just for surveyors. They are great for family and community gardens. Go online to www.quickstake.com or contact your local land surveying supply dealer and get you a box of Quick Stakes. You'll love them every year when you plant your garden. Again, that's Quick Stakes, Q-U-I-K Stakes, the truly preferred way to stake and identify what's in your garden now.
My name is Kyle Hayes, a motorsports student at Alfred State College. Every year, Alfred State students compete in the Great Race, which is a cross-country time endurance rally for vintage vehicles. As you can imagine, it's pretty costly. I'm asking for your help. Your donation can make it possible for these students to live their passion and promote the vintage automobile industry. Please visit our site at give.alfredstate.edu and search Great Race to learn more and help us reach our goal. Thank you.
In 2009, the membership organization Docs for Patient Care was founded. People all around the country wanted to participate in the efforts of this group, and they wanted to join, but they were unable to do so unless they were physicians. It's for this reason that the Docs for Patient Care Foundation was created. Now, everyone can join the fight and become a member of an organization created by doctors for patients, dedicated to fighting for your healthcare freedom and preserving the doctor-patient relationship. While you're at your computer, please go to www.docs4patientcarefoundation.org. That's www.docs4patientcarefoundation.org and make a tax-deductible donation and join the fight along with us. Thank you.
This is America's Web Radio. Would you like to have a show, talk about your business, or express your opinion on America's Web Radio? Just email gm@americaswebradio.com and we'll get back to you. Thank you.
This is Professor Robert D'Agostino back with Do Facts Matter. And I want to read a couple of quotes from Lenin, the collected works of Lenin. But I want to also, before I do that, I want you to listen to this carefully. There's these left-wing groups out there, violent, vandalism, they beat people up, they stop people from speaking, and they're very much alibied by Democratic office holders as just, oh, well, you know, they have good intentions and they're fighting hatred and all that stuff, because they're the big hate groups, for sure. Here's something that, before I read from Lenin's collected works, this is what Mark Levin, and of course Mark Levin is a constitutional scholar and a very conservative broadcaster. And this is here's what Mark Levin says about Antifa. He calls it the, quote, the paramilitary militia wing of the Democrat Party. And he does that because, quote, the Democrats either defend it or they're passive in their criticism of it, or thirdly, they say nothing. So we have essentially what's happened in this country is a Marxist, Leninist movement. And the Democrats are the political wing of that movement. The media is the propaganda wing of that movement. This is truly a culture war. And the academia, the universities, are the intellectual wing. You know, intellectuals are those people that, what George Orwell said, there's some things that only an intellectual would believe, and that's certainly true. So we have a intellectual wing, the universities, most of the universities, propaganda wing, the mainstream media, political wing, the Democrat Party, and what Mark Levin calls a paramilitary wing, Antifa, RAM, and those other violent left-wing groups.
Wait a second, Robert. You said this what we have is Marxist-Leninist. Am I quoting you right?
Yes.
What, you know, in my education, that means communist. And this is what I don't understand about people today because of education. Socialism is one step away from communism, or at least that's what I was taught back in the black era, black days of my education, and we're there.
Well, socialism, of course, is the utopian's idea of an economic system, and therefore, if you're going to impose a utopian system, a lot of the basis of it is radical equality. And the only way you get that is coercion. So the more coercion to make socialism work, because it never does work, then they say, oh, we don't have enough coercion, don't have enough power in the center, don't have enough. The vanguard doesn't have enough power, and so you keep on passing more and more rules, more and more regulations, being more and more violent, more and more coercive, and you're communist.
What we've been saying and preaching literally last month, is the fact that if you look at socialism at its worst, or socialism in reality, all you have to do is look at Venezuela, or you look at some of the other countries that have turned socialism. Our definition of socialism is taking the people without weapons. Then communism, the next step, is holding the people that are rebelling against socialism with weapons. And the difference is socialism is no weapons, communism is with weapons.
Well, that's interesting you should say that, because there was some commentary that Alinsky and Lenin, among others, that said, well, first we get power by voting. It'd be ridiculous to confront our enemies when they have the guns. So we get power by voting. We get the guns, then we don't have to do any more voting. That's, one man, one vote, one time.
And look at Venezuela.
Well, of course. If there was a free election in Venezuela, they'd kick out the current government. Maduro would go. But he can't allow that to happen, and he won't. And he's got Cuban troops to support him. He is surrounded by Cuban troops, not by Venezuelan troops. What protects him and his administration are Cuban troops. They're down there, and Maduro pays money to Cuba for those troops. It's like Cuban doctors. Oh, Cuban doctors are so good, except they're not in Cuba. Cuba sends them all around the world, and the Cuban government is paid for their services. That's how Cuban government gets foreign currency. The health care available to Cubans, other than if you're top of the Communist Party or a tourist and wish they can get good health care, but the people of Cuba, at least those who come out of Cuba, who fled Cuba, said health care outside of the Communist Party leadership and outside of tourists is terrible.
Well, this is what we reported on our show, Let's Talk Venezuelan, this week. The fact, and we have direct lines to Venezuela. The Josie Cruz that's running for the 6th district against the gentleman that says Guam is listing to the left and going to sink. Mr. Johnson, that's been around too long and needs to be replaced. But anyway, Josie's running against him, and then Carlos was in. They were in, and they were talking about what they're getting told from Venezuela. I mean, this is not hot off the press. This is hot off the telephone. And like they were pointing out during their show is, socialism is wonderful. You get free medical care or free prescription. Whoa, wait a second. The only problem is you can't get an appointment to see a doctor. And the other side of it is, even if you could and they wrote you a prescription, they have no medicine in Venezuela anymore. It's been done. It's been taken over by the government. Anything that came in that was a drug to be used for medical practice has been confiscated by the government. So you can't see a doctor. You can't get the drugs if you needed them.
But it's all free.
Absolutely. They don't charge you a thing for misery.
In a future, that's interesting. In a future show, I'm going to talk about medical care and the fact that U.S. has the by Lenin brutally destroyed all opposition. The first to go was freedom of the press. As early as November 17, 1917, an official Bolshevik resolution defined the free press as a weapon in the hands of, quote, capitalist poisoners of the minds of the people, unquote. Lenin pursued the method with absolute brutality, repeating constantly, quote, the resistance of the exploiters is crushed, and established a rule that is unrestricted by any laws, and concentrated in the hands of a full-fledged oligarchy, the Party Central Committee, and the Party Central Committee consisted of intellectuals. Lenin was big on having intellectuals rule, the same people that George Orwell said would believe anything. We must encourage the energy and mass character of the terror against the counter-revolutionaries. We must act with all energy, mass searches, execution for concealed arms, mass deportation of Mensheviks. Mensheviks were socialists, social democrats, and unreliables. Essential, this is all quotes from his writings, essential to crush the Kulak arising with great energy, speed, and ruthlessness. Essential to suppress the Kulak extortionists mercilessly. Essential to combine ruthless suppression of the Kulak left socialist revolutionary. So here's Lenin talking about terror. Lenin stated that the Bolsheviks must be prepared, quote, for the day in which they would defend the achievements of the dictatorship of the proletariat using the most radical and effective means of revolutionary struggle, Red Terror. Well, I wanted to end the show with a prediction, and the quick prediction is that assuming if Trump is reelected, even by a landslide, there will be increased violence. There'll be violence before the election by the left, the paramilitary wing of the Democratic Party, and there will be violence after the election, and particularly if Trump is reelected. We have not seen the end of the violence from the left, Antifa and those other groups allied with Antifa.
Hello, this is Michael Daly with Atlanta Healing Center. We know that addiction is a brain disease. Addiction is a family disease. Addiction is a treatable disease. We have a caring professional staff with over 30 years experience to help you and your loved ones in your recovery. You can reach us at